and about 10 or 15 years before he became king of all of Israel. And as he became king, it was after the blessing of, as far as 1 Samuel is concerned, his killing of Goliath. Now, Goliath was an Anakim. Does anybody know what an Anakim is? An Anakim was a type of people, kind, that'll help us understand a lot of things about the land that the Jews went to take. They were given the land of Israel. They were given the promised land. They were given that by God to Abraham. Then after they were given that, they came into the promised land and they turned it down. When they turned it down, they went into 40 years of captivity. In that 40 years of captivity, God worked with them to try to give them some confidence in his word. They frankly never received it. Then when they came into the promised land or got to the border, the Moabites infected them. Do you remember the Moabites? Lot's daughters, children, by Lot, which of course happened after Sodom and Gomorrah was inundated from fire from God in Genesis 19. Then when they turned into the children of rebellion, the Moabites didn't seem to serve God. And we went through this with Ruth, didn't we? Was not Ruth a Moabite? Yeah. How is it that Ruth, being a Moabite, turned out to be such a servant of God? And better than that, the mother of Jesse. Who was Jesse? The father of Jesse. Who was Jesse's mother? No, Ruth was David's. Ruth was David's grandmother.
Okay, so you asked who was the mother of Jesse.
Who was the mother? Who was the wife? No, I asked who's the wife of Jesse. Play the tape back. Okay. Who was the wife of?
Yeah, well, thank you, dear.
Who was the wife of Jesse? What was the reason that all of this story is told? Don't everybody answer at once.
Because Jesse thought that David was not his.
Wrong. But that's true. Jesse did not claim David as his son. Why?
Ask the question again.
Who was the mother? Why is this story told?
Christ. It's a rejection of the Son. It's a story of Christ. It's a rejection of the heir and the Son, the true Son.
Well, basically, no, but that's okay.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Why is the story told? For our learning, our edification. For what are we going to learn from it, and how are we going to be edified?
That the Jews are not really a genetic lineage.
No.
Well, that's one of them.
Now I've already let's go through this again. Everybody with me, all on the same page. Who was Ruth? A Moabite. Who was Jesse?
He was the son of a Moabite.
And who was Jesse the father of?
David.
Which made David what? A half-breed.
Okay.
And if David was a half-breed,
Both Jew and Gentile, that's what you're trying to say.
if we consider, and it is true, that the Moabites were Gentiles, why then was this told? To show that the king of Israel was not purebred. Why would that be important? to show that the king of Israel is still not a purebred Jew. What was the king of Israel? He was God and man, not a purebred Jew. He could not trace his legal ancestry back to Abraham. And when he got to David, what stopped it? Jesse. How did Jesse stop it? Because Jesse knew that his daddy Boaz had married a Gentile named Ruth. Well, there were some other kinks in this armor too. When they came to Jericho, they found Rahab. Who was Rahab? The great-great-great-grandmother of David. Man, who was Rahab? A prostitute in Jericho. And she's the one that let the two spies down the wall with a rope. Saved their lives. Who were the two spies? Joshua and Caleb. And what did they promise her by being let down the wall?
We'll be back.
They would save she and her family. Exactly. And so because of that, we now have another discrepancy in the ancestry of the king of Israel. So why was Jesse, by the way, Nestareth is the name of Jesse's mother. How do I know? It's never mentioned in the Bible. I went back to the writings of the Jewish Talmud, and I went to the writings of those people of that time, and they tell you her name. Why is she important, and why was she not known?
You're saying Rahab was not her name? Is that what you're saying?
No, Rahab was the name of her grandmother.
Oh, okay.
Rahab was the name of the harlot in Jericho. Why is it the story? What did Jesse do? What was the purpose of him doing what he did? Was it to prove that David wasn't Jesse's son? No. What was the purpose? To prove that Jesse wanted to remove the cloud on his family name for not being a true-blooded Jew. So what did Jesse do? He made an agreement with his housemaiden. And he said, you find me a true-blooded Jewish woman, pure as blood as can be found. And you set it up with her so that we can have a rendezvous. What happened?
His wife disguised herself.
His wife, yes. Jesse's wife disguised herself and met Jesse at night. And of course, as they rendezvoused, she was impregnated. Did she run into Jesse and say, guess what? I'm pregnant. She did, but you know what she didn't tell him? That it was his child. So what is it that Jesse, being a gentleman and full of valor, decided to do? Better than that.
He claimed him as a son.
Better than that. Let me ask you a question. When Joseph found out that Mary was pregnant, what did Joseph do?
He stood by her.
Well, he wanted to divorce her.
What angel? Yes, because if he'd have if he'd have reported her, she would have been killed. What did Joseph do? Stood by her? Who said that? Okay. What do you mean standing by her?
He honored the betrothal that they had.
Okay, and there was a difference in the betrothal and the marriage. So when he stood by her and she was not stoned, what story are we emulating? Jesse and David's mother. Then what happened with David as far as the sons of Jesse and Nestoreth, I think that's her name, Nestor, N-E-S, I think it's Nestoreth. What happened to the other 7 sons that Jesse had by his wife?
Well, he was treated as an outcast, and they were treated as
So much to the point that when they would come together to eat, where would David eat? Out in a barn. Not allowed to come to the table. Not even acted as a, because, hey, Jesse was going to raise the boy. His wife had the child. But he wasn't going to accept him as his son. Now comes Goliath. When Jesse's son went to battle under King Saul, they were there, and they were stout and stalwart men. They were the epitome of Jewish ancestry. But when they went up against Goliath, what did they do?
Cow down.
Yes, sir. They accepted the fact that somebody could talk about the God of Israel and the king of Saul like they were dogs. So, not knowing, beknownst to Jesse, or Jesse not knowing this in advance, he sent some food and some clothing to support the army. Who did he send with the food and the clothing? David. So when David gets to camp, what's the first thing David hears? Goliath out there running his mouth like a fool. David turns around, looks around, and he says, "What's this all about?" The one brother comes up to him and says, "You keep your mouth shut. We know you're a grandstander." How did they know he was a grandstander?
Well, they thought him killing the bear and the lion and all that was braggadocious.
Yeah,
I
they'd.
don't know that he killed anybody. It had to be.
Oh, how would they know he was a grandstander?
That's what I'm saying. It had to be carried that way. And they were,
Okay.
jealous.
And you keep your mouth shut because we don't want any trouble here. But he said, is there not a God of Israel? Is there not somebody in Israel that will stand up for God? His oldest brother, and I forgot his name, said, well, it's sure not going to be you. And David said, I'll fight Goliath. And somebody heard him. Now, so badly were they abused mentally by Goliath and the Philistines that somebody ran to Saul to tell him this story. And David's brothers couldn't stop it, and nobody else could. So Saul calls David in front of him. He says, did you say you'd fight Goliath? He said, right. What's your credentials? Well, like you say, I fought a bear. I fought a lion. I've done this. I've done that. And my God was always with me.
The shepherd.
Yeah. And he says, you'll go fight Goliath? He said, yeah. Well, he said, let me give you my armor. Well, they put Saul's armor on David. And Saul was about 6'2" or 6'4", and David was about 5'4". It didn't fit. David says, here, you keep the armor. I got God. And so Goliath comes back out about that time running his mouth. And so David goes out into the valley. And he goes out there with nothing but a slingshot. That's all. And as he goes to cross the brook, and some of them have even said it was the brook Kidron. I don't know. But as he goes to cross the brook, he picks up 5 pebbles. That's all he needed. When Goliath got to running his mouth, David put one of them right between his eyes. And it killed him, bluntly. And when he killed him and he fell down, David took a Goliath's sword, which was about the size as David was tall. And probably with all the strength that he had in his arms, he picked it up and cut off Goliath's head. Well, when the Jews saw it, they were just beside themselves. And then David led the attack, and the rout of the Philistines was on. Now listen to these stories. Who was the mother of David? A supposed woman of prostitution and whoredom. Who was David's supposed father? They didn't know, but they knew it wasn't Jesse because Jesse didn't know. Who was the father of Jesus Christ? It wasn't Joseph. It was God. What did they think of Mary in around Nazareth? She had been taken in whoredom, and they accused her of having an illicit sexual relationship. With whom? They said with German Hessians, or German soldiers that were being brought in by the Romans to help guard the land. The stories parallel greatly, so that the Bible could prophesy. But now, let's read the story of David in 1 Samuel 17. It says, and David was the youngest, verse 14. And the three eldest followed Saul. But David went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep of Bethlehem. And the Philistine drew near morning and evening and presented himself 40 days. What are you going to know about 40 days right immediately? Numerology tells you something is about to change. 40 is always the number of that which comes about when something is going to change.
It really represents renewal.
It's or a change, yeah.
So they didn't know it.
No,
Things was about to
yeah.
change.
I'm sure that the 40 days meant nothing to them. They were scared to death. And Jesse said unto David his son, Take now for thy brethren an ephah of this parched corn, and these 10 loaves, and run to the camp to thy brethren. And carry these 10 cheeses unto the captain of their 1,000, and look how thy brethren fare, and take their pledge. In other words, see if they're still strongly behind Saul. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. Were they fighting? No, one was on one side of the hill and the other was on the other side of the hill, and they just sat there spitting at each other. They hadn't really gotten it on. Why? Well, here's the answer. David rose up early in the morning and left the sheep with a keeper, and took and went as Jesse had commanded him, and came to the trench as the host was going forth to the fight, and shouted for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had put the battle in array, army against army. And David left his carriage in the hand of the keeper of the carriage, and came into the army, ran into the army, and came and saluted his brethren. And as he talked with them, behold, there came up the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of the Philistines, and spake according to the same words, and David heard him. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him, and were sore afraid. And the men of Israel said, Have you seen that man that has come up? Surely to defy Israel is he come up. And it shall be that the man who killeth him, the king will enrich him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. What does that mean, free in Israel? They would no longer be a servant of Saul. They would be something as great as Saul. All right, so here we go. David spoke to the men that stood by, saying, What shall be done to the man that killeth the Philistine, and taketh away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him after this manner, saying, So shall it be done to the man that killeth him. And Eliab, that's his name, Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spake unto the men. And Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, Why camest thou down hither? And with whom hast thou left those few sheep in the wilderness? In other words, boy, what are you doing here? I know thy pride. I've heard you run your mouth. And the naughtiness of thine heart. You had put yourself on a pedestal that you didn't deserve. Well, how many lions had Eliab taken care of? Zero. How many bears had he taken on? Zero. Exactly. And he was saying David had a naughty heart. In other words, he was in conceit and pride. For thou art come down that thou mayest see the battle. You're not here for any other reason. You want to see the show. David said, What have I now done? Why are you jumping on my back? Wait a minute. Let's look at this thing with the right eyes. Is there not a cause? Isn't somebody going to take up for God? Don't we have a reason to give our life? Isn't there something that should be done? And he turned from him toward another, and spake after the same manner. And the people answered him again after the former manner. And when the words were heard which David spake, they rehearsed them before Saul. And he sent for him. Now you can imagine old Saul was about as desperate as they got. If you're 6'2" and you're going to take on somebody about 9'7", you don't think you've got a whole lot of chance. Now you got to appreciate that. And so anybody to act as a sacrifice, Saul might have thought that he could cause the action to change scenery. And as they were in the battle, he hoped the kid could stay in there for at least 2 or 3 minutes. They could attack them from behind or the side. In other words, it would be something to throw off the attention of Goliath, and they might be able to kill him. David said to Saul, Let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, Thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for thou art but a youth, and he is a man of war from his youth. And David said unto Saul, Thy servant keeps his father's sheep. Somebody will say he's going to give him his testimony. No, he's stating fact. I keep my father's sheep. And there came a lion. I thought Samson was the only boy that could kill a lion. Somebody said with his bare hands, Will you tell me the difference of the bare hands and somebody that's nothing but a slingshot? Here came this lion. And then there was a bear. And they took a lamb out of the flock. And I said, there ain't nobody can go up against a lion. How in the world would you expect my daddy would expect me to give my life for one of these 4-legged, woolly-backed animals? No. What did David do? I went after him and smote him and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he arose up against me, I caught him by his beard and smote him and slew him. What was the difference with what David did and what Samson did? We don't know what Samson did but break his jaw, the lion's jaw. We don't know how he got his attention and got him down to where he could break his jaw. David said, I grabbed him by the beard and I killed him. The servant slew both the lion and the bear. Now, not just one at a time, was there? This was the tag team match. Here was the bear and lion against the boy. And David said, hey, they both came, and here I went. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear. Now you say it doesn't say at the same time. Maybe it was at different times, but you kind of get the impression that they were both trying to take that sheep and take it home to eat. Well, they say, when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, smote him, and slew him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear. And this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he defieth the armies of the living God. Oh, he wasn't going to give him the last word, was he? David said, moreover, the Lord then that delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear. Didn't it sound to you like they were both after him at one time? You got a tag team match here going up against a 5 foot. They claim if he made 5 foot, that would have been big at this time. Going up against this kid, 4'11", let's say. And here goes this kid, goes in amongst, and of course somebody says, well, it wasn't a big bear. I don't know if you've ever gone up against a bear. I don't care if they're big or little, you don't want to bother them. Yeah, but if you got a tag team match, man, he will deliver me out of the hand of the Philistine. And Saul said unto David, go, fool, the Lord be with you. What else did Saul have to send? See, he was going to be a diversionary force. And I don't know Saul's mind, but it sounds to me like if Saul was a man of war, and he was, that he was trying to figure out how to get Goliath's mind off of what was going on. And if he could send his kid, maybe Goliath would get to laughing so hard his sides would get sore, and there'd be no way he could go into a battle against the kid. But it didn't happen that way. Saul armed David with his armor, and he put a helmet of brass upon his head. Also he armed him with a coat of mail. That's over his vestments. That was over his chest. And David girded his sword upon his armor, and he essayed to go. For he had not proved it. In other words, he didn't have any, he'd never had a sword or something like that in his hand. He didn't know how to use it. David said unto Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not proved them. And by the way, as far as we know, David never took a sword. Yet he circumcised 1,000 Philistines one day. That boy had a pocket knife. The point is, he just didn't need it. He had God on his side. And he took his staff in his hand and chose him 5 smooth stones out of the brook and put them in the shepherd's bag which he had, even in the scrip. And his sling was in his hand, and he drew near the Philistines. Now you got to say that boy is weak in the mind. Can you imagine going up against somebody like that? Yeah. Just total trust.
In the context of what you had said last, he had circumcised 1,000 Philistines in a day. What's the context of that word, circumcised? I said, in the context of what you were saying a couple sentences ago, where you had said that he never used a sword, but he had circumcised 1,000 Philistines in one day. What was the context of that word?
To show that he never used the sword to fight the enemies of God.
So he would kill them. That's the word for circumcised?
And you understand the concept of circumcision. They won't lay down and allow that. So they have to be dead. The Philistines came on and drew near unto David, and the man that bare the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him. There's where I said he got his ribs sore. He laughed in his face. Well, wouldn't you? For he was but a youth and ruddy. You know what that ruddy means?
Small in stature.
Red hair. Red hair.
Red hair, smooth skinned, looked like a baby. He had a baby face, baby skin. He was ruddy. And the Philistines said, man, I don't kill kids. And he was of a fair countenance. And the Philistines said unto David, am I a dog, that thou camest to me with staves? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I'll give thy flesh unto the fowls of the air, and to the beasts of the field. Then said David to the Philistine, thou camest to me with a sword and with a spear and with a shield. But I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. This day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand, and I will smite thee and take thy head from thee, and I will give the carcass of the host to the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and with spear. Now you see why? He don't need these things. He can handle it. For the battle is the Lord's, and he'll give you into our hands. And it came to pass when the Philistine arose and came and drew nigh to meet David, that David hastened and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. He didn't take off and run the other way. There wasn't no rabbit in his legs. He was heading toward into the battle. With what? A slingshot and 5 stones. Where and what was he going against? Somebody almost exactly twice his size and armed up to the hilt. And David put his hand in his bag and took thence a stone, just one, and slang it, and smote the Philistine in his forehead, that the stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell upon his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and smote the Philistine and slew him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. You wonder why he keeps talking about not having a sword? He's proving the point. Therefore David ran, stood upon the Philistine, took his sword and drew it out of the sheath thereof, and slew him and cut off his head therewith. And when the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled. Well, what would you do? Turn that little mighty mite loose on me? No, no, no. I can't fight somebody like that. There's a problem here, folks. He's got God, we don't. And the men of Israel and of Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines until thou come to the valley and to the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell down by the way unto Sheraim, even unto Gath and unto Ekron. And the children of Israel returned from chasing after the Philistines, and they spoiled their tents. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem. But he put his armor in his tent. And when Saul saw David go forth against the Philistine, he said unto Abner, now that was his captain, the captain of the host, Abner, whose son is this youth? Where'd this boy come from? Abner said, As thy soul liveth, O king, I don't know who this kid is. Why wouldn't he know? If he'd have gone to visit Jesse, who would he have not seen in the house? David. So Abner didn't know who he was. And the king said, you inquire and you find out whose son the stripling is. Well, do you hear old Eliab going up and saying, that's my brother? Yeah, me, It's like these football players. I scored a touchdown, but I did it all by myself. Do you see them all doing that? No. The king said, you find out who it is. And David returned from the slaughter of the Philistines, and Abner took him and brought. Would you think Abner took him manfully? Or he said, sir, would you follow me?
Leave your sling here.
He had 4 stones left.
Yeah. Leave your sling here.
So he takes him, and Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. Now you say that's a gruesome sight. But it proved the point. And Saul said to him, whose son art thou, thy young man? And David answered, I am the son of thy servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. And it came to pass when he had made an end of speaking unto Saul, and I don't know what that conversation was, but I imagine that there was a whole lot that Saul tried to find out about this boy. When it came to end of speaking, that the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David. Why? Man, I found somebody I can follow. This is the captain. This is the leader of the army of God. And he said, I can't get over this. Who had been the captain of the army besides Abner? Saul. What had Saul done? He'd slung back in cowardice. Instead of being the king of Israel to fight against the enemies of Israel, Saul had become a coward. Then Joshua and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. And Joshua stripped himself of the robe that was upon him and gave it to David, and his garments, even to his sword and to his bow. Would you, if you had been Jonathan, would you have given that kid a sword? Not me. Well, he didn't need a sword. And David went out whithersoever Saul sent him, and behaved himself wisely. And Saul, ma'am? But he took the sword of the enemy. Well, you're right. I guess it would be kind of hard to cut the head off with those rocks, the little stones. David went out whithersoever Saul sent him, and behaved himself wisely, and Saul set him over the men of war. Where'd Abner go?
He was demoted.
Sir?
He was demoted.
Yeah, he's second man in the rank here. And he was accepted in the sight of all the people. Man, wouldn't you kind of walk around and say, yes, sir, yes, sir. Anything you say? You got something you need? Yes, sir, let me know. And also in the sight of Saul's servants. And it came to pass, as they came, the saddest thing happened to David that ever happened. What had been promised the avenger of Israel that became the saddest thing that ever happened to David?
King's daughter.
The king's daughter.
What a mess.
Yeah. When she came in and returned, the slaughter of the Philistines, that the women came out of all the cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tabrets and with joy and with instruments of music. The women answered one another as they played and said, Saul hath slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. And what happened to Saul?
Yeah, that's the scripture that Mike was talking about the other day when you said that Saul was greater than David. And I doubt that that's what that means. That verse says just the opposite.
Yeah. Saul was very wroth. Well, why? Because he was a coward and been shown to be one. And here's this little punk that had carried the day. He was displeased with David and said, they have ascribed unto David 10,000s, and to me they've ascribed but thousands. And what can he have more than this, than the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day and forward. And it came to pass on the morrow that the evil spirit from God came upon Saul, and he prophesied in the midst of the house. And David played with his hand as at other times, and there was a javelin in Saul's hand. And Saul cast the javelin, for he said, I will smite David even to the wall with it. And David avoided out of his presence twice. Do you think if you'd have been Saul, you'd have tried to kill somebody that Goliath couldn't even touch?
I don't know, pride and hatred do funny things.
Yeah, they do.
And it causes you to do things that you wouldn't think that you would normally do.
They cause him not to think. Well, the evil spirit, it was something that was going to destroy him. He could not get that out of his mind.
I think that's what's wrong with the opponents of Trump. They're so blinded by their own hatred that they're making fools of themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. And Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him and was departed from Saul. What a story. Why is it that people then look to Samson as the strong avenger of Israel and fighting animals and bears and lions and all that stuff, and never they say because David had a slingshot? Wow, I'm impressed. With this, we have one of the greatest men that God ever placed on the earth to be placed in a position to take over the house of Israel and Judah. And what happens to them is the only one that is left to take David's position and make it sure is God. Yes, sir.
Didn't David end up turning around and stabbing God in the back, or at least attempting to?
Who?
Didn't David end up turning around and attempting to stab God in the back in the end? Or turn away from him?
David?
David. No.
King David?
King David?
No, sir, not that I know of.
I thought there was a king that God had blessed with many.
That's his son, Solomon.
Oh, that was his son.
Well, Solomon just denied him, yeah. But David never did, as far as I know, ever cause God a moment's of displeasure until he decided to kill the adopted father of Bathsheba.
Why did that cause displeasure?
Sir?
Why did that cause displeasure?
Because he took a man's life. And the man whose life he took was the father of the woman that David later married.
So it was just because he had taken that specific person's life? That's why he was upset?
No, because David forgot that God's will was always what was paramount. And so when the Jew went to battle, the Jewish soldier, what was one thing that David instituted that they still do today in the Israeli army? They sign a covenant of divorce. Why?
In case they get killed in battle.
Well, there is the greater chance that they'd be killed in battle. So why divorce?
So the woman can remarry.
Ma'am?
So the woman can remarry?
For what reason would she need to remarry?
For support.
To feed her. Yeah. There is still in the Israeli army today, and always was amongst the army of Israel, that when the soldier went to battle, he signed the divorce papers. Many times people don't know that. They don't say anything about it. But it's still true. Now, as you go through these stories, you'll go on over, I think it's in 1 Chronicles, the 17th chapter, that David goes in before the God of heaven, Christ. Where is that? And when he does that, God tells him of why he is his servant. Maybe it's 1 Kings 17. I think it's the 17th chapter. No.
How about when David and the king sat before the Lord?
Yeah.
He said, "Who am I, O Lord God?
Yeah.
Is thine house without?" I'm sorry, verse 16.
Where are you?
I'm sorry. First Chronicles 17, verse 16.
Yeah, that's what I thought. 1 Chronicles. Yeah, just to conclude the story. Let's go.
David the king came and sat before the Lord, and said, "Who am I, O Lord God, and what is mine house, that thou hast brought me hitherto? And yet this is a small thing in thine eyes, O God, for thou hast also spoken of thy servant's house for the great while to come, and hast regarded me according to the estate of a man in high degree, O Lord God. What can David speak more to thee for the honor of thy servant, for thou knowest thy servant?"
Yeah, keep going. You were doing all right. We were able to stay up with you.
Got it on the right pages. O Lord, for thy servant's sake and according to thine own heart, hast thou done all this greatness, in making known all these great things. O Lord, there is none like thee, neither is there any God beside thee, according to all that we have heard with our ears. And what one nation in the earth is like thy people Israel, whom God went to redeem to be his own people, and to make thee a name of greatness and terribleness, by driving out the nations from before thy people, whom thou hast rendered out of Egypt.
Redeemed, yeah.
Redeemed, I'm
Yeah.
sorry. For the people of Israel didst thou make thy own people forever, and thou, Lord, becamest their God. Therefore now, Lord, let the thing that thou hast spoken concerning thy servant and concerning his house be established forever, and do as thou hast said. Let even be established, thy name may be magnified forever, saying, I, the Lord of hosts, is the God of Israel, even the God to Israel. And let the house of David thy servant be established before thee. For thou, my God, hast told thy servant that thou wilt build him a house. Therefore thy servant hath found in his heart to pray before thee. And now, Lord, thou art God, and hath promised this goodness unto thy servant. Now therefore, let it please thee to bless the house of thy servant, that it may be before thee forever. For thou blessest, O Lord, and it shall be blessed forever.
All right. So who was the servant of the Lord that was blessed and blessed forever? The one to whom David was praying. Could David have prayed to God the Father?
No.
No. To whom was he praying? Christ. And he said, I don't deserve it. I didn't think I did all that much. But if that's your will, put me in there. I'm a team player. And I'll do exactly what you want done. I like this verbiage here in the Old Testament, in the King James. David becomes before God, and he's just like a little child as he comes before God. And he says, who am I? And what is my house that thou hast brought me hitherto? You know me. You know that you've made me greater than any other amongst men, for those who have an estate called humanity. and have put me in as a high degree. And why was he put in such a high degree? Because he would father the Son of God on this earth. Now the one he was speaking to became the Son of God, born of Mary in Bethlehem.
Was David, with the exception of Christ, of course, was David the most exceptional or the most pure of the kings that God had appointed? And I was asking that question because I was thinking about it and I was like, if he was, it would make sense why they call it David's throne. They don't have any other king's thrones, as it says in the Bible. They just have David's throne.
Okay, I can answer the question by asking you one. Why is it called the seed of Abraham?
Because Abraham led the children out of bondage in Egypt.
Abraham never was.
That was Moses. Sorry.
Now don't get us on Noah.
Yeah, it's probably his lineage.
No, because there were things called patriarchs. What was a patriarch? The head of a distinct, designated kind of a family. David was a patriarch, but you say, well, David wasn't a patriarch, he had a daddy. Well, David didn't have a father of the kind or type that David became. Well, let me let you read it. It took me years to figure this out, believe it or not, because I couldn't figure it out. It didn't make sense. Turn to Acts 2.
So because David was the head of a family of kings now, because it started with him, because his original father wasn't a king, that's why he led that, he's a patriarch, that's why he led that.
Well, better than that, but you're awful close, yeah.
So they have the seed of Abraham, because he started that off, and then now they have the throne of David, because David was the first one.
And I turned to Acts 2. In verse 30. No. Start verse 29.
2 and verse 39?
29.
29. Okay. And it says, Men and brethren, let me freely speak unto you of the patriarch David.
What does he call David? Yeah. Saul didn't have this. Saul's sons were promised, if Saul had been faithful, they could have been kings. But since Saul was unfaithful, of course God made David king, but David was a patriarch of kings. In other words, he was the originator, the first of his kind, the first one of his being.
God made him that way.
That's right.
Okay. He wasn't anything before God came along, and he,
Well, sure.
for the glory of God, this was established.
That's exactly right. Just like it was Abraham's
Not for
seed.
David, and not for the Israelites, and not for anything else, but to prove God is God.
Yeah. Let me speak unto you of the patriarch David. Ain't nothing like him. Yet, all these premillennialists think that Jesus is going to come back one of these days and be seated on David's throne. What would be the problem with being seated on David's throne? Well, it no longer exists, but what other thing?
Already occupied, she said. It's
Huh?
already occupied.
It had been occupied how many times? 39 more times. Would not every one of those after the resurrection from the dead have a right to be seated on that throne? Sure. Yeah. But it wouldn't happen. Interesting story. I always have thought that they kind of shorted David a little bit. I mean, he killed the dynamic duo. And what did he have in his hands? A sling. What was the hymn of invitation? 592. Would you stand, please?